So welcome to the webinar on building great leadership teams with Ruth Wageman. Ruth is one of the authors of the book Senior Leadership Teams, and we will look forward to a discussion with Ruth about building great teams. The demands of those who occupy the top roles of organizations are rapidly outdistancing the capabilities of any single person, no matter how talented. That is why executives are turning to their direct reports for help in meeting the challenges they and their organization face. However, many stumble when creating a leadership team. Drawing on Ruth's research of 120 leadership teams from around the world, Ruth will, during this webinar, explain how leaders can actually put in place certain conditions that increases the chance that a group of people will develop into a superb team. Ruth holds a master's in social psychology from Howard University, and her PhD is also from Howard University. Ruth believes that the most important problems and aspirations of our time can only be addressed by brilliant collaborations. She's one of the foremost scholars and practitioners studying and working with teams, especially leadership teams. The core of Ruth's research has been focused on the conditions that influence superb team performance, resulting in a 6 team conditions framework, which she will explain a bit more about later. Ruth has been a professor at Columbia and Howard, and she's also worked for the Hay Group. My name is Jesper Bergman, and I'm the director here at AVT Business School, and I'll be your host for this webinar. You can ask questions through the chat function during the webinar, and I'll keep an eye on it and ask Ruth these questions along the way. So welcome, Ruth. And it's a great pleasure to have you here. So I'd like to start just by asking, how did your interest in team performance actually begin?
Well, like most people, I've had a mixed set of experiences in teams. I've had experiences working with other people that were incredibly energizing. And what we were able to do together was better than anything each of us had imagined as individuals when we first came together. So I can think of lots of research collaborations and actually practice collaborations that really were places that I grew and developed in my capability as a consequence, and we accomplished great things together. And at the same time, I've had lots of experiences of teams that I would say crashed and burned, that ultimately never produced anything particularly admirable. And what we did come up with, any one individual could have done in probably a 1/6 of the time that it took for all of us. So that's just one aspect of it. And that really was a puzzle that made me want to understand, are there any reliable, predictable influences on whether a team really grows into a wonderful collaboration that accomplishes great things? And if so, what are those influences?
Right, great. But how do you know when a team is actually effective? I mean, are there many measurements, or is it a feeling? How do you actually measure it when a team is actually?
Well, we have a particular way in our research of defining team effectiveness. And I think the important thing is to recognize that every team has clients, it has stakeholders that it exists to serve. So for leadership teams, it's a very complex array of stakeholders. They have the employees of the organization, they have shareholders, they have the clients who are served by whatever it is that the organization produces. So they've got a whole array of stakeholders, but any team, even like a frontline team, they have clients that they exist to serve. And ultimately the question is, is the team actually meeting and preferably exceeding whatever those stakeholders actually need from them? And that can be complicated to measure, but it's always measurable. Ultimately, it's the client of the team that gets to assess that. But we also take two other things into account, which is, I think no organization can afford to have teams that produce something amazing once and burn themselves out in the process. So for us, a team is a great team if it serves its stakeholders and it also gets better and better as a team and develops in capacity over time, including really contributing to the growth of the individuals. So that's what we mean by a superb team. And that's what we went out there looking for, teams that really lived up to those criteria of effectiveness. Yeah.
Great. But how do you actually distinguish between a group versus a team, or is it that something that you focused on?
So I would definitely draw a distinction between the two. I'll speak about it with respect to the leadership team's research. Let me just show a slide here that is one of the common challenges that we saw when we were studying these leadership teams around the world. And that is, here we are, that, are you seeing, is this a real team?
Yes.
Most of the leadership teams that we studied were actually leadership. They were teams in name only. So something more like, yes, for what you called a group. So many chief executives, if you ask them, how many members are there on your leadership team? They'll answer the question, well, I have 12 direct reports. But that's not really answering the question of who are the members of your team. Really, that's driven by what are the critical functions for this enterprise, leadership functions that really would be better fulfilled by a group of people working together in interdependence with each other. And then who are the group of people that can actually contribute to that work? That's what makes it a real team. It's bounded, it's
Right.
stable long enough to actually accomplish something together. And they also have a shared accountability of something meaningful that they need to accomplish. And a lot of the teams that we see at the tops of enterprise really are just the group of senior leaders, each of whom has their individual jobs to perform, but they're not really being asked to do much together collectively.
Right. And just on that note, have you seen any change? I mean, over the years in terms of executives having their own area of responsibility or working more as a team?
We have seen more and more chief executives recognize that just leading their leaders one-on-one and having each individual take care of their own silo is really not enough to address the critical challenges or the wonderful opportunities that are facing any enterprise today. So, for example, I was working recently with a leadership team in the professional services business, and they're organized regionally. So each regional manager has responsibility for the growth of the enterprise in a particular geographical area. And what they've been recognizing is that in the current state, with economies reopening, there's an explosion of opportunity out there. And yet each of the regional managers is making completely independent choices about what they pursue. And when you step back, you realize that this firm cannot win on all fronts. At some point, they have to put their heads together and say, where are our unique competencies? And what are some things that each of us individually may have to set aside so that all of us collectively can go after the really big opportunities? And that's a much more sophisticated conversation than each of the individuals pursuing their own opportunities. And one of the things that we learned in our research on leadership teams is that there are really different kinds of leadership teams, and I'm going to describe them from the least interdependent to the most interdependent. And so the first kind that we see is what we'll call an information sharing or alignment team. And back when we first started studying leadership teams, this is what most leadership teams were doing. They come together, to provide each other updates about what's going on in their individual area of the business, but they don't decide anything together. They don't perform any work together. It's just intended to get them better informed and aligned about what's going on in the enterprise as a whole. And for a lot of leadership teams, this is actually a terrible use of their time. They're not really dealing with the big strategic questions in front of them. They're just keeping each other informed about individual things going on that actually may not even be particularly relevant for the other people around the table. What we've been seeing, even those leadership teams turning to more frequently, is what I'll call a consultative team. And again, this is a team that's not making decisions together or performing work together, but at least they are coming together to say, here are the challenges that I'm facing in my market or in my function. Here's my best thinking about it, and I would like your advice and counsel. So there, at least the team members are bringing their collective intelligence to bear on the critical leadership challenges that individual leaders are facing. More interdependent still, and many more organizations have these days, is a leadership team that is a coordinating team. So when an enterprise decides to undertake some transformative change or to implement a major initiative in the organization, this group of leaders shares collective responsibility to make sure that the implementation, the timing, the sequencing, the different pieces all come together in an effective and aligned way. And then finally, I think the most powerful and the most increasingly prevalent use of leadership teams is to really make collective decisions together. So that example that I gave, where we have to come together and identify what are our best market opportunities and pursue those priorities together, that would be an example of a decision-making team.
Fantastic. But sometimes, if you don't get to decide your team, you might think, well, my team is doing all of it together, all in one go, so, but how do you see that? Is that an issue or?
Well, a lot of teams attempt to fulfill all four of these functions with the same team. And what we have found is that many complex enterprises actually benefit from having more than one leadership team. So I'll get, for example, one chief executive that we interviewed stepped into the chief executive role, and he had been on what was called the management committee for many years. That was the senior leadership team. And he said, there were 14 of us on the team, and we were supposed to do information sharing and coordination and make some decisions together. But in fact, with 14 people around the table, basically everything devolved to mere information sharing, and we never got around to making the key decisions. That happened behind closed doors with only a few key leaders involved. So when he stepped up to the role, he decided he would formalize the idea of having an information sharing team that owned the culture and the alignment of culture in the organization. And he actually expanded that group and kept the name the management committee, and made that a 20-person team of the senior leadership cadre. But he launched two new leadership teams. He started a coordinating team that he called the operations committee, led by the chief operating officer, which was really managing the interdependent activities of keeping the operation running, and then a smaller executive committee who was his decision-making team. And we've seen lots and lots more firms really answering the question, how do we do this collective leadership well by creating interlocking multiple leadership teams that serve very distinctive functions and that are very clear about who is and who is not a member of those teams.
But I assume there's also some politics and the organizations that you work with, you might have an executive team, and certainly, the CEO says, well, we'll split you up. Have you experienced that? Yes. I'm just guessing here.
Part of the reason I shared this particular example is that I thought he was very smart about the politics. So he didn't dissolve the management committee and say, you guys are not part of the leadership team anymore. He kept the name of that team. And in fact, he included more senior leaders in that team, and they were still the management committee. And then in addition to that, he formed two new teams. And what we found is that when chief executives are very clear about who is the decision-making team, most executives are mature enough to recognize that they have a voice, they have other ways of being involved, and that they cannot be in on every decision. And in fact, in most cases, when the chief executive finally says, "This is my decision-making team," people say, "Finally, we all knew that, but now we actually can be transparent and public about who's actually holding the critical decision authority in the organization."
Right. I know from our last conversations, we also talked about, whether you have an agenda and you kind of say, okay, this is just information sharing, this is decision-making element of the agenda, etc. Is that a way, if you have a small team and you can't influence it too much, set up separate teams, etc. Is that also an approach that you think is effective?
Yes, and so you're talking about some of the structural elements that we found are a really important part of leading a leadership team well. So I'll just briefly share another idea here from our research. I always like to say one of the ironies of leadership teams is that everyone wants to be a member of the team, but nobody wants to go to the meetings. So a lot of times this tendency to devolve into information sharing has become such a routine that the leaders around the table don't really find it a good use of time. Real leadership work is not what's actually happening. And very often that is for a variety of reasons. First of all, many leadership teams are much too large to actually accomplish meaningful work together. So our rule of thumb is to keep it in single digits. So 9 or fewer is about as many voices as you can get around the table. But secondly, the way that a lot of agendas get built for leadership teams is by the chief executive, or more likely the chief executive's chief of staff or administrative assistant, goes to all the team members and says, "What do you guys want to talk about at this meeting?" And the answer to that tends to be whatever operational, tactical, urgent thing was on their minds at the moment the question was raised. It takes a lot of very intentional design of the agenda of a leadership team to really have them tackling meaningful leadership work. So we learned in our research that if there are big strategic questions that need to be answered, like there's a war for talent going on and we are losing people, and how are we going to proactively address that? That needs to be at the top of the agenda, and it needs to be placed there by the chief executive, and the team needs time to really grapple with these big issues and land it in decisions before they tackle anything more trivial and more operational. So giving the team the chance to be operating in thinking and conceptual mode is a really critical part of designing a team well. We came to call this sound structure. So having the right size team that is working on meaningful leadership tasks and that also have very clear norms of conduct. In fact, it was those norms of conduct, really having agreements about what's acceptable behavior and what's not acceptable behavior. That was the single thing that most distinguished the really outstanding teams from the ones that were struggling or that were less effective.
Right. So this is a scale that you're showing about how they scored, right? So it's not that you need 4.2 people on the.
No, it's a scale overall in terms of, are they the right size? To what degree do they have meaningful tasks, and to what degree do they have clear norms of conduct? That's right, and higher scores are better.
Right. So you just showed the 6 conditions framework just briefly. So what does it take to have a great team?
Yeah, I can share the full framework. I was sharing with you just a couple of the ideas, a couple of the conditions that we discovered. But let me just show you the whole framework so that our participants can get a sense of the full set of ideas. So we started out by talking about what do we mean by an effective team, and I said it's a team that serves its stakeholders well, that gets better and better over time, and that actually contributes to the learning and development of the members. And what we have explored in our research is what are some of the designable features of teams that you can intentionally put in place that collectively increase the chances that a team will really grow into a team that accomplishes all of those. And we divided them into the 3 essentials. So these are fundamental building blocks that every team has to have in basically good shape if you want to get anything good out of the team at all. And then 3 enablers that accelerate the development of a team into a really superb leadership team over time. And so the 3 essentials are, if you want to have an effective team, first you need to build a real team. This is the bounded, stable, interdependent team. That secondly, it needs a compelling purpose. And a lot of the leadership teams that we studied recognized that their potential for impact on the enterprise as a team was enormous, but it wasn't clear what it is that they must do together. What are the critical leadership functions? And so having a compelling purpose is having a purpose that is clear, challenging, and consequential to the team members. And then the third one that we haven't talked about, it's really having the right people on the team. And that's not necessarily all the direct reports to the chief executive. It's really the people who can take an enterprise perspective and who are willing and able to work effectively with others to achieve that compelling purpose for the leadership team. And then the 3, yes, go ahead.
So, yeah, sorry, Ruth, because I think many people then struggle perhaps with having the right people on their teams. Maybe they were put in a team, maybe they're not the team leader, etc. So how does teams then work with the people they have if they're not able to have new ones coming in with the right competencies, so to speak?
I get that question a lot. I think that the assumption often is that to have the right people on your team, you have to get rid of some and bring in some others. But let me give you a couple of alternatives. Sometimes having the right people on a team really means looking at the collection of people you have to draw on. And you may actually have multiple teams. When you ask the question, what is the work that needs to be done and that needs to be done together over and above the individual jobs?
Right.
And then who can contribute to that? I often encourage leaders to do a kind of matrix of what are the capabilities that you need to fulfill that work, and what are those capabilities that you need everyone to have versus key skills that at least one member needs to have. And if you're missing some, that doesn't mean you need another person. It may be a developmental agenda. So that then the question becomes, how do I develop some of these key people to have the competencies and capacities they need to do the work that we're accountable for? So it doesn't always involve going to DEFCON 5 and getting rid of people. It may be actually reconfiguring them, but also developing their abilities. And the other thing that we find with a lot of leadership teams is there's a tendency to default to including everyone. But in fact, there are a lot of senior leaders who are actually just individual contributors, and that is fine. It's fine to have some individual contributors. Not everyone needs to be part of teams in order to be important leaders as part of the enterprise.
Great. So the enablers.
The enablers, yeah, we talked about the first. We talked about the first one, which is that sound structure. So the work that is in front of the team is real leadership work that contributes to the success on that compelling purpose. The team is small enough, and they have norms of conduct. The second of the enablers refers to features of the overall organizational context. So all of us in teams operate in a larger context. That context has structures and systems that can be designed either to make teamwork easier. So for example, we could have rewards for excellent team performance. We can have information systems that are designed to get the team the data they need in a timely way, synthesized in a way that they can use it. But a lot of times our structures and systems actually place obstacles in the way of teamwork. So if you want to have a great team, you really also need to take a look at those contextual supports and be sure that they're not placing obstacles in the way of teams working together effectively. And then the last of the enablers is someone who is available and has the expertise to provide some hands-on coaching. And so this is someone who will work directly with the team as a whole around the way the team is working together, ask some good questions, help the team reflect together on what's working, what's not working about the way that we are operating. And so collectively, these 6 conditions we see as the essence of team leadership. So team leadership in our perspective is designing a team and getting these conditions in place and keeping them in place over the life of a team.
Great. If you are in a team and it's not working that well, members feel that the meetings are a waste of time, perhaps, etc. So is reconfiguring? Is it so? Where do you start, basically?
So we developed an idea that I think a lot of leaders have found pretty reassuring, which is the idea of having a team relaunch. So
Right.
One of the things we've learned is that these acts of team leadership, getting the conditions in place, really are most effective from the beginning of the life of a group. In fact, the most powerful thing you can do as a team leader is do that design work really well, and then get the team off to the best possible start. But if you find yourself with a team that is struggling and that is not achieving its purposes, and that is declining in capacity over time, the best thing that you can do is look at the 6 conditions and say, do I have a real team? Is the purpose clear? Do I have the people who can contribute to that purpose? Do we have good norms of conduct in place? Do we have the resources we need? And if the answer is no, it's perfectly okay to push the pause button and say, we're not going to struggle on in this poorly designed configuration. We're going to stop working this way as a leadership team, and I'm going to relaunch. I'm going to essentially call a do-over and do the design work well and get that new configuration off to the best possible start. So a lot of the work that we do in working with senior leaders and in working with leadership teams is really helping them redesign themselves in an effective way and to get off to a really excellent restart.
Right. Time is flying, Ruth, so we only got a few questions more. So during the last 16 months or whatever it's been with COVID-19, what's some of your experiences through that period? I mean, have you seen elements of this, or how have you experienced this last 16 months?
One of the things that has been, I think, most compelling and surprising to me is how many teams really became their best when the crisis began. And all of a sudden, because you have a workforce that is struggling, you have a major disruption to deal with, many teams pulled together in a way they never had before, because they had a compelling purpose and they drew together all of their best thinking capabilities in the service of really keeping people well, keeping people safe, and keeping the firm alive. And so it's been inspiring to see how many leadership teams discovered capacity that they had not actually had before. Now the challenge is, as the world is stepping into recovery, there's still massive disruption going on. And as economies are recovering, there's massive opportunity. And so can they build on the capacities that they discovered in themselves at the beginning of this crisis and really pull together in the same way to recognize what are the opportunities out there and how do we continue to lead effectively as a collection of leaders? So I see a lot of inspiring things happening in teams, but really this is a great moment for teams to reflect on why they were so good during that crisis moment and say, how do we bring that sense of a compelling purpose and the interdependence and the willingness to work together collectively? How do we bring that spirit into the recovery?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ruth. And we are looking forward to meeting you later on this year at ABT. And if you need any help, this might be your first step. So read the book, Senior Leadership Teams. There's a lot of great tools. And of course, the 6 conditions frameworks that Ruth talked about today to help your teams get even better. So thank you very much for joining in. We'll send you the recordings afterwards to those who might not have been here the whole time. But thank you for joining, Ruth, from the US, and a good morning to you. And we'll see each other a bit later, to all of you.
Look forward to it. Thank you. Thanks again. Take care, all.